How's it going, everybody? This is Novakast back with another video for you guys. And, okay, this one's going to be interesting. Because, I'm not going to lie. I've been thinking about this particular way of doing this for quite some time. And I may do this on and off for older films. Especially for films that we more likely will not get to see more of. But, regardless, this idea came from something that I started doing for the anime episode reviews, where I do a couple of episodes for each review. So here we go. This is going to be a movie marathon review. And what better way but to start off with Indiana Jones. Yeah, one of, at least for me personally, one of the most inspirational and well-known movies I had ever seen growing up. And kind of seeing how it goes. So, without further delay, why don't we go ahead and get started with the Indiana Jones Marathon Review. Alright, so, first movie to talk about. Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark. 8 out of 10. My final rating is 8 out of 10. And I'll explain why. Directed by, or at least it was released 10 years actually before I was born, which was 1981. Directed by Steven Spielberg, written by Lawrence Kasdan, and screenplayed by George Lucas, starring people like Harrison Ford, Kieran Allen, Paul Freeman, etc. The movie itself, at least described in IMDb, reads that in 1936, archaeologist and adventurer Indiana Jones is hired by the U.S. government to find the Ark of the Covenant before Adolf Hitler's Nazi can obtain its awesome power. Now, I think it goes without saying, this movie is a classic. And from start to finish, it is nothing but action-packed. There are a couple scenes that are kind of slow, like in between. Whereas, just to give a quick mention, the scene at the school, the scene at the bazaar, the scene on the ship, which, by the way, spoilers, and the quick scene where one of the characters, Marilyn, is, even though it's to some extent suspenseful, the scene where Marion is kind of held captive towards, or like from one of the main villains. But anyway, the story itself, again, it is nothing but action-packed from start to finish, and it is awesome for doing so. Now, going further, relates to the next thing, characters themselves. Characters are interesting. When I first saw this movie, Indiana Jones, or Indy, as he's called, is an interesting, if not, I want to say, complicated character. Because at first glance, especially near the very beginning of the movie, we see him at just some, forgotten jungle, trying to obtain a rare artifact. And the next scene after that, we are seeing him in a school wearing regular clothes as a professor, and is teaching people how to perform, or at least act, in a archaeological setting. When I first saw this as a kid, I always thought it was interesting, because to some degree, and I hate to use the term, but to some degree, you see Indy kind of pulling a double life, where by day he is the boring archaeological professor, but at night he is the stoic adventurer type character. And sure enough, to see him go after the Ark of the Covenant, it is, the greatest adventure for him of all time. I was always intrigued by that. Miriam, who is I guess the love interest was a lot of fun, especially with some of her scenes. She gets captured a couple of times, but to some degree, she is able to kind of get herself out of trouble. And I will say probably one of the best scenes is literally where she's being captured, or at least held captive, by Indy's rival, Belloc. And in order to escape, she literally drinks him under the table. Now, since we've been talking non-stop about good things, I have to talk about a negative. And holy shit, besides Belloc, the Nazis are very, very fucking one note. Like, no joke. I besides the strong freaking Nazi that literally gets chopped up by a freaking airplane propeller, and this one creepy motherfucker that we see a couple of times, the Nazis themselves are really, really, really fucking one note. And it just, I kind of got bored of them. They weren't amusing to me at all. And I think if anything, the only amusing part of it was when they got killed. Spoilers. But, anywho. Now, going further, let's talk about music. Music itself is a lot of fun. There's a lot of good soundtracks from this movie, and I will say that the music for this film was the basis for, and I'm talking about the other films now, just for a brief second, because I don't want to repeat myself when it comes to music. Music itself, or at least the music for this film, was the framework for a lot of the other tracks that we see pop up for the later films. Movies like Temple of Doom, the Last Crusade, as well as the one that everybody loves to hate, Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Again, the music for this one was the keystone or cornerstone of what we see in here for the later films. So I gotta give mad props to the music itself for this particular movie. And that's something I've noticed, especially when it comes to films that have sequels, is usually the music for the first film is usually the framework for later films. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, I'm just saying it's something that's noticeable. Now, going further, final rating. Story itself, venture, non-stop, which I absolutely adore. Our characters, villains are one note, very, very, very one note. But when it comes down to it, they're counteracted by our hero characters, who are very interesting, to say the least. Music itself is good and is the cornerstone of the later movies' music. And final rating, again, because I kind of set it up for this film, is a 8 out of 10. It's a classic and I enjoy it. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Released in 1984, written by Steven Spielberg, or directed by Steven Spielberg, written by Willard Huyck, and screenplay by Gloria Katz, starring Harrison Ford, Kate Capshaw, and Ke Huy Quan. Hopefully I said that name correctly. Reading IMDb, it describes the movie, which says, in 1935, Indiana Jones arrives in India, still part of the British Empire, and is asked to find a mystical stone. He then stumbles upon a secret cult committing enslavement and human sacrifices in the catacombs of an ancient palace. So this is one that I think a lot of people were kind of on the fence about. Or if anything, the audiences were kind of split down the middle of whether or not this one was really good or if it was a downgrade to what we've seen with Raiders of the Lost Ark. First off, the story itself is actually really interesting, and especially with it starting off with it being in an area, I think it was Hong Kong, and then due to unfortunate events, it then trails towards a ancient palace in, I believe it was India, and just one thing leads to another where they are involved in this whole situation where they're dealing with not just with a cult, but a variety of other suspicious characters. And again, it's interesting, and I'm going to say, I think if anything, what really kind of set people up with whether or not this was either better or worse than the original was some of the casting. And I'm looking at this in the eyes of like certain individuals. Now, first off, Harrison Ford, still really great. Though, to a large degree, we only see him in the adventurer type scenario. Where, again, in this situation, and actually at first I thought he had a career change at the very beginning where he's, trying to get the artifact and he's like buying it. So if anything, he's like either some kind of collector, or if anything, he's more of a businessman who's, trying to get a piece of, artifact for his home decor. I don't know. That was the first thing I got when seeing this movie originally. But after that, again, we see him in his adventure getup. That's all we see him of for the entirety of the film after that. Now, the thing that really got people a little bit upset was them swapping Marion out for Willie Scott, who's played by Kate Capshaw. Now, okay. This one is an odd one, because I'm not going to lie, I was not very fond of this character, because I think some people said it best. The only way that this character was acknowledged, or at least was understood, was from the variety of screams that she was able to bring out in this film. If anything, she only spoke through scream. Either that or whiny, self-entitled freaking like dialogue, which again I acknowledge and I agree, this character was kind of a downgrade to Marion from the previous film. Then we also have Ke Huy Quan, who played Short Round, who was this little Chinese kid, and some people were a little bit upset with this character, either being one kind of insensitive or kind of like a kind of shoehorned sidekick character. Honestly, I was on the fence of whether or not I should not like this character, because that would be bad. But I think if anything, it was an interesting character to bring up, or at least kind of place in the scenario of what was going on. And to be fair, we do get a kind of quick backstory as to why this character is following Indy. But regardless, it was an interesting character, and they tried doing something different, which I will applaud them. Now, going further, the cultists. I had this argument for the previous one because, oh my gosh, I hate to make this argument again, but I kind of felt that the cultists were one note. I feel so bad, but I have to say it. I feel like the cultists were one note. The only one that didn't was the leader, who, if I remember correctly, was it Mola Ran? No, I think it was Mola Ran. The leader, he was the only one. But even then, like half the time, it just seems like everybody for the villains is one note. They do something really intriguing where it comes down to, at first they're villain, where the lord of the palace that this cult is under is one of the villains. And to some degree, it's interesting But other than that, yeah, I'm not a fan of the villains. So, I guess if anything, giving final thoughts, story itself is still very good. That's the basic strong suit of the story. As well as, hero characters are good. Villains, meh. But above all, the movie itself was interesting, to say the least. And if I were to give a final rating for Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, it would have to be 8 out of 10. Just 8 out of 10, like Raiders of the Lost Ark. Alrighty. The movie that really should have ended the series, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, which was released in 1989, directed by, again, Steven Spielberg, written by Jeffrey Boom and George Lucas, starring Harrison Ford, Sean Connery, Alison Doty, and many, many, many others. Described on IMDb, in 1938, after his father, Professor Henry Jones, Senior, goes missing while pursuing the Holy Grail, Professor Henry, Indiana Jones, Jr., finds himself up against Adolf Hitler's Nazis again to stop them from obtaining its power. Now, I made the remark that this was supposed to be the one that ended the series, because literally this was, like, how it was set up, was supposed to be the last film of Indiana Jones' story. But, again, we'll be talking about it in a little bit, it's not. But anyways, Indiana Jones, the story itself is pretty intriguing, especially when it comes down to Indiana Jones Jr. following his father or his footsteps in order to unlock the secrets of the Holy Grail. Main characters themselves are a lot of fun. I think, if anything, one of the best moments has to be Sean Connery and the other character, who I cannot remember their name at this current time, as they're trying to escape a Nazi tank, which I thought was a lot of fun. We have the usual or typical scene where which, something I haven't talked about for these movies, there's usually one fight scene where Indy's going against somebody who is, like, has 2 feet over him. The dude, like, whoever he's fighting is, like, built like a giant, and gets knocked out or killed in a very hilarious way. To some degree, we don't get that in this film. Especially when it comes to the Nazis. But instead, it's somebody, they kind of break the mold a little bit with this one. But characters themselves are interesting. Sean Connery, who plays Indiana Jones Senior, was a lot of fun, especially with the back and forth between Indiana Jones Senior and Indiana Jones Jr. I think probably one of the best scenes, especially when it comes down to their situation, or if anything, their relationship, is a scene where they're on a blimp, and Indiana Jones, who is trying to get his dad's attention, literally, when given the attention, has no idea what to say or act towards his own father. And I think that's one of the biggest things, especially when it's set up. We know right away that there is a strained relationship between Indy and his dad, but that slowly builds as time progresses, or builds back up. But anyway, going further, the kind of as before, main protagonists are a lot more entertaining than the villains. We do have a couple, which, for those who have not seen the films, I'm not going to spoil one of them, but we have a businessman character who, I'm not going to lie, I almost mistaken for Belloc for a brief moment, till I realized that Belloc is dead. But the businessman character kind of reminds me a lot like him, which was really unfortunate because I feel like they could have done something a little bit different. Especially with, again, selling out his own country for the sake of the artifact that they're trying to collect. But anyway, I'm going further. Once again, Nazis. They're fun. They're fun due to the fact that they're one note. And I'm kidding. Yeah, Nazis, not entertaining whatsoever at this point, especially when it comes to some of the action. They're literally just cannon fodder. But other than that, they're lame. So, anyways. And actually, if anything, because I don't think I've talked about much of story. The story itself is intriguing, especially since we get to see like how Indy becomes the way he is, what motivates him near the very beginning of the movie, what he has gone through, why he's afraid of snakes, which, if I haven't talked about it yet, which I'm sure I haven't, yeah, he's afraid of snakes. We get to see why he's afraid of snakes, which in of itself is actually kind of hilarious. But going further, he's afraid of snakes. We see where he gets his hat, where he gets, actually, if anything, where he gets his look as an adventurer, which to some extent, like seeing that first time, I'm like, he's ripping off this other guy, which I thought was hilarious. But anyhow, we get to see his upbringing a little bit. We get to see how his dad was kind of in his eyes, kind of neglectful of his own son. But other than that, it is an interesting adventure that we see in this movie. So, final verdict, because again, the story itself is interesting, cool, awesome. We get to see Indy's backstory and how he became the person he is. Characters, at least main cast, is interesting. And besides one, the villains suck. And going further than that, it's an awesome movie. 10 out of 10. That's, I think, if anything. And I know that I gave the others a 8 out of 10, mostly due to, again, because of, the Nazi thing. But I want to put this in perspective. Because even though I've shit on the whole Nazis being the villain thing, or at least the villains being like the lowest point of the film, the reason I'm giving this one a 10 out of 10 is due to the fact that how it was set up to be the last film originally, and pulling off that send-off in such a glorious fashion. So in that regard, 10 out of 10 for The Last Crusade. It is an awesome film. Okay, currently, the last film of the entire series. Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Released in 2008, directed by Steven Spielberg, written by David Coep and George Lucas. Just reading a few, as well as starring Harrison Ford, Cate Blanchett, Shia LaBeouf, and many, many, many others. Now, oh my gosh, how do I talk about this? Because this one was a downgrade compared to the other films, and that's an unfortunate thing to say. For starters, as always, the story itself, I mean, at least the setup for it is interesting, and it's actually way back, like way forward in time. In fact, as it's described in IMDb, it's kind of set in, or at least around 1957, where Indiana Jones is called back to, or becomes entangled in a Soviet plot to uncover the secret behind a mysterious artifact known as the Crystal Skull. Now, I will say something that's really interesting about this film is the time period. Because, again, with everything going on with the Cold War, the Red Scare, the situation, or it starts off with literally Indiana Jones and a individual who he's working with who literally betrays him, being captured by the Soviets, is immediately shamed and questioned of being a Soviet or somebody who is endorsing Russia. And in that regard, which, by the way, some of our major heroes or other characters that we saw in the last film are dead. We get a new caretaker, or at least head dean of the school, who is also apparently leaving. We only see him like once till the very end. Everybody ends up, wanting to leave due to, or at least go to new areas, considering everything that's going on with America and Soviet, or Russia, I should say. He's contacted by a young youth played by Shia LaBeouf, which the character's name is Mutt Williams, who we later find out is Indy's son. Spoilers, by the way. I'm not gonna lie, since we're kind of talking about characters, I didn't like Shiloh's character. He was annoying, obnoxious, and it was even dumber when we find out that Shiloh's character was Indy's son. Cate Blanchett, who plays like the head villain, was to some degree interesting and disturbing. And I say disturbing more so with, the scenes with, because I guess around the time where between the Cold War, they were testing the abilities of psychic abilities and how they would work. And sure enough, Cate Blanchett's character plays a general in the Soviet Union who is researching psychic behavior or psychic abilities. And sure enough, this character, there's one particular scene that is actually really intriguing that really creeps me out. And I'm not talking about near the very end where the villain gets her comeuppance. No, I'm talking about this scene. There's a scene in the middle where they use a crystal skull to torture a character. Not going to talk about which character, but a character. And the dialogue that she gives is really, really, really unsettling. Though to some extent, her acting kind of reminds me of what she did for, if I remember correctly, playing as Lady Galadriel, which I think that was Blanchett. Yeah, Lady Galadriel. Just kind of doing a quick search. We have Karen Allen, who comes back as Marion, who I thought was, I actually, if anything, the dynamic between Harrison Ford and or Indiana Jones and Marion was always great. It sucked that they kind of removed her from the second and third films. So to kind of have her back was awesome, to say the least. John Hurt, who I'm going to say is a really fun actor, also comes back as this kind of not crazed, more like loony professor who is bonkers, off his rocker, doesn't know what the hell he's doing in of himself, and he ends up becoming like the ultimate key of figuring out what's going on with the Crystal Skull. Now, going further, because again, I hate to shit with the characters, shit on the characters, because again, besides the main villain or the main leader, all the Soviet characters suck. One note, not much to talk about with them. Story itself is really good. Settings, or at least locations, are nice, to say the least. I think the one scene that really got was really fun would have to be the military jeep chase, where there's it starts off really good, but once we get to Shia LaBeouf fencing with Cate Blanchett, I'm just kind of like, I tuned out a little bit. Then we get to the part where they fall off the waterfall, which for a second I'm kind of thinking, oh, are they going to end the movie this way? No, it turns out that's not the case. But either way, it was fun. So, gosh, this... I honestly, I don't want to shit on an Indiana Jones film or give it a bad rating, but I'm going to be perfectly honest. Besides the story, the characters themselves are, including the main cast, are kind of shadows of themselves. The main villains, besides one, are not interesting. Shia LaBeouf, who plays as like kind of the youth character, was not fun to begin with, and was annoying almost the entire run of the movie. And above all, it's bad. It's bad. So, final rating, I'm just gonna go, I hate to do it, but I'm gonna give the final rating for this a 6 out of 10. This is not the best movie, and unfortunately, it's... I will... You know what? Yeah, I'm just gonna say it. It's not as bad as a lot of people claim it to be, but it has its faults, and unfortunately, it suffers from them. So, 6 out of 10 for Indiana Jones, Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Alright, now, discussing the series as a whole, one of the strongest points of the series itself is just the adventures that we end up having to, we get to follow with Indiana Jones, and as well as the rest of his party. Villains themselves are, and throughout all the films, are one note, besides, a few examples. Other supporting cast are kind of hit and miss as time progresses through each film, especially the despised Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Music itself, again, throughout all the films, is amazing, and the renditions that followed from Raiders of the Lost Ark are just amazing, and I love the renditions for each and every other film. So, going past that, and quickly going over all of my ratings, Raiders of the Lost Ark gets 8 out of 10. The Temple of Doom gets 8 out of 10. Last Crusade gets 10 out of 10. And Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, 6 out of 10. So, with that is my marathon review of Indiana Jones and the films that come from it. What are your thoughts? I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. With that, though, I think I'm going to go ahead and end the video here. Thank you guys so much for watching. Truly appreciate it. If you guys can, please leave a like, comment, share, subscribe, all the good stuff. If you guys want to follow us on social media, links are in the description down below, as well as check out our daily content and the weekly podcast. With that being said, this is Rob Novakast signing off. Have a good one, and take care. Peace.
2, 3, 5.